think we can get started. If I'm on, do you hear me? Yes, excellent. Well, thank you and welcome to this second session of this conference. And my name is Anna Wieslander. I am the Director for Northern Europe at the Atlantic Council and also serve as Secretary General of the Swedish Defence Association, Allmänna Försvarsföreningen. And it's my pleasure to moderate this session on threats against the democratic process.
So for those in the room that this is old news, I'm sorry that you're so well read. We were set a task, we being the little think tank I've created at the LSE, to have a look at the German elections, have a look at foreign influence campaigns in the German elections. And we were just looking at the information part. We weren't looking at the fact that every German party is, has serious investments into it by the Kremlin. We were just looking at the internet and broadcast stuff. And we started kind of looking at Russia, simply because that's an obvious one. That's what everybody obsesses with at the moment for very good reason. And we did a sort of broadcast monitoring of Russian media, of RT and Sputnik, which broadcasts in German. And surprise, surprise, Sputnik was just massively biased towards the AfD. The AfD is the German version of the Swedish Democrats. They're kind of the far-right party which pretends to be a kind of far-right conservative party. You scratch the surface and they have little swastikas everywhere. So I'm not saying the Sweden Democrats are there. I'm just giving you a rough parallel of the sort of thing we're talking about. So Sputnik weren't even hiding it. They weren't even trying to be balanced. They were negative on all parties, very positive on the AfD. But then we kind of started following. So, but who really watches Sputnik? It's a bit of a joke, let's be honest. It has like 3 followers on Twitter. But it was getting this crazy amplification online. So not a lot of people were kind of reading the site itself, but it was doing quite well on Twitter. And we found a whole sequence of bots. Bots are automated Twitter accounts, which were kind of pushing the Sputnik material. We couldn't tell whether these automated Twitter accounts were Russian or German. They could well have been Germans. They could well have been AfD activists, because their other activity was kind of far-right stuff about Germany. So they were doing hashtags like Merkel muss weg, or MAGA, Make Germany Great Again, and lots of stories from Sputnik. And then we're kind of following where these stories ended up, and they ended up in these weird, dank spaces of the German internet, what German media now call the parallel universum. Germans have great words for this stuff. And it's a very strange mixture of Russian stories, local far-right conspiracy stories. You'll be glad to know there is a lot about Sweden in there. And there's stuff about Sweden which maybe you haven't even heard of. I mean, I found out that you guys are all pedophiles, girls marry each other at the age of 7. Malmo is literally all of it is a no-go area. A lot of stuff about Sweden. And a lot of stuff from the Swedish right as well. So there's this whole culture out there, completely fenced off from the mainstream. We started doing bigger analyses of the German media space. And you have people who follow the mainstream newspapers, then you have this weird parallel world. We started flagging this up to our German media partners. We worked with Axel Springer on this story. And we were like, we think you may have an issue here. And they're like, oh, it's just a fringe. AfD, nobody's going to vote for them. Ended up getting like 12% of the vote and are about to become the biggest opposition party in Germany. But we decided to go even deeper than that. So some friends of ours, with a sister organization that we worked with, they decided to go undercover into the kind of German far-right space where you organize online campaigns. Now, to do that, and I can talk about this openly now, I think. To do that, you have to go through quite a lot of tests. So you have to create a fake social media avatar to make yourself look like a far-right activist, which means saying that you really like Nietzsche and Heidegger and really don't like immigrants. And then they let you in a little bit. And then if you want to go further into these closed social media groups, they sometimes ask you to do a Sieg Heil in front of the camera, so they have a picture of you for later, so they can use that as compromise against you. Or they'll ask you to do a little DNA test and send in your DNA to prove you've got no Jewish or ethnically untrue blood. Look, it's not difficult to cheat that. It's an initiation process. You can get somebody else's DNA. But it's just part of the process of them letting you in. And once you got inside of there was like a war room. It's on a channel called Discord, which is a gaming channel, basically giving instructions how to hijack hashtags. So that means if there's, I don't know, a pro-SPD hashtag, you attack it and twist it so it starts spitting out messages which are for the AfD. This was all in support of the AfD. or you attack, there's some right-wing video and you go out there and you boost that video by giving it lots of likes, or you vote down a video by the left wing or something. So these kind of essentially marketing operations, calling it war is a bit like they glamorized themselves by calling it war, but really it was no different from Reebok, using the internet to sell their trainers. Here they were just selling fascism. And it was a very interesting community doing this. It was German. And that was a very interesting moment. So they were putting out some campaign they were doing, some silly ad campaign they were doing to boost the far right. And there was a wonderful moment. We caught them talking to each other online. They were like, our campaign's doing really, really well, but it's not us who's pushing it. And they started realizing that actually a Russian bot network is now supporting them without them even realizing it, or without them even having asked for their help. So we then traced this Russian bot network, and we've traced back the person who's behind it. A bot network, for those who don't know, is a network of automated online accounts that can boost a certain campaign artificially. Yeah? So they can help raise the profile of an online propaganda campaign. And we traced back the person who was running it, and there was a guy in Nizhny Novgorod who did he did all sorts of things. I mean, he ran campaigns supporting the far right in Germany. He ran ads for escort services in Dubai, and he also did smear attacks on Russian opposition, and he also did ads for hospitals in Russia. So basically, he was a PR guy that you could hire to do anything you wanted. And we asked him, so how much are the AfD paying you? He's like, oh, we have mutual interest, I'm doing it for free. So obviously somebody in the Kremlin or near the Kremlin had asked them to do a favor, we assume. So the reason I'm going on this long excursion is we started looking at one thing, and we ended up on this crazy journey where really, I think it's very hard to talk anymore of inner, outer, foreign information campaign against our domestic sovereign space. We just don't live in that world anymore. We're already living in a global information village, but the village is full of zombies and, demons, basically. It's already happened. If we're still thinking these categories of foreign, domestic, inner, outer, we've completely missed the story. These are toxic international networks coalescing organically, or sometimes, most of the time, inorganically online, and creating internationalized campaigns. And the quicker, when we start thinking of our responses, we're going to have to be as internationalized and as supple and as fast-moving as they are. But so far I've just talked about the far right in Russia. So the Falun Gong were also involved. So the very popular Falun Gong paper in Germany called Epoch Times, which is the biggest alternative news site in Germany, which for purely financial reasons does pro-Kremlin propaganda and far-right propaganda. They found a nice market niche and a bit of Falun Gong propaganda. So the amount of actors involved, all for completely different reasons, is really dizzying. So I was only given 10 minutes. So very quickly, summing up, what are the kind of threats to democracy from this? One is kind of an operational one. There are people doing all sorts of, let's call them influence operations, from all sorts of places. The barrier to entry is very, very low. The second one, though, is much deeper. It's this idea of a parallel society within society, this idea of a parallel universum, this idea of increased polarization. That's a much more insidious idea because at one point, the public space necessary for democracy starts to break down. Yeah? And the problem is it's very democratic to have polarized groups. This is something that democracy is all about. But there seems to be a tipping point now, and democracy stops functioning in a healthy way. America is a great example of that, where we have parts of the country who simply now live in parallel universes. I'm going to stop there, because I think we've got to the point of the threat to democracy, both operations and sort of philosophically, in a much deeper way. I mean, essentially, I suppose, I'll leave it with this idea. What we're getting at is the idea that our libertarian interpretation of free speech, much like our previous libertarian interpretation of the market, might not work. It turns out you can do fake stocks and trash the market, like we saw in 2008. You can do fake information and trash the free speech markets as well. So those are very difficult questions, I think, to answer, but I know my colleagues have those answers.
Thank you so much, Peter. Just a follow-up question, since you took the German example now, but I mean, you've been following these questions for some years now. If you just make a European kind of overview, on these concerns that you raised, how concerned should we be because the EU is also taking action. So I'm trying to get someone who has this kind of helicopter perspective if you look at the European continent. Would you say that, you know, that what you saw in Germany, is that something that sets the level for Europe as a whole? Or is it worse or less?
Every country actually is unique and has very surprising strengths and weaknesses. So Germany actually is one of the most centrist countries, and the media is among the most respected in terms of trust. So the fact that we were seeing a parallel universum in Germany, of all places, is highly worrying. So in Italy, it's much, much worse. In Italy, you have a small amount of the population who read the main newspapers, like 5%, and then everybody else is on Facebook, where they're in a kind of sewer of disinformation. Much of it pervaded by several parties. So that's that situation. But what Germany's problem is, you know, kind of paradoxical, because it has strong centrist media. It means they have no official media that can cater to the far right, or to the Querfront, as another great German word, Querfront. That's the unification of the far left and far right, which we see everywhere. So there's a huge space that can be occupied. Now in Britain, we have kind of the opposite problem. We don't really have very strong centrist newspapers. We have the BBC, but in terms of newspapers, they're kind of madly polarised. And we have some, like, well, I'm not going to name any names, but the Daily Mail is a disgrace. Which you know, supported Hitler in the 30s as well. But, so, and we're always complaining about it, how terrible it is to have such a right-wing rag. But there's a good thing to it as well. It means it soaks up on the far right. The attempts of the far right in Britain to create their own media, Westminster Gazette, if you ever want to look at it, have failed because you can't get much more right-wing from the Daily Mail. So the Daily Mail, weirdly enough, even though we complain so much about it, has a strange effect of bringing in, you know, the nuttier bits of the right into something much more centrist. So every media system has a slightly different model, and understanding that model, understanding that dynamic is very important.
Thank you very much. We will come back to the discussion, and we will also have time for questions and remarks from the audience. So if you have something you wonder about, make a note to yourself, and we'll get back to you in a while. But our next speaker is Martin Kragh, who is head of the Russia and Eurasia program at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs, UI. And Martin's research interests include Russia's economy and history, but also the political development in Russia and the former USSR. Martin holds a PhD from Stockholm School of Economics and is Associate Professor Docent at the Uppsala Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies as well. And you specifically researched on this topic some years ago also, I should add. So please, Martin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you, Peter, and the previous speakers and the organizers for this very interesting workshop and seminar. The war on democracy, I was thinking about it as I prepared my notes last night. Yes, I think there is a war on democracy, and I'm not sure we're winning it, but I'm not sure we're losing it either. What we're seeing today in world politics, I think, is the diffusion of authoritarian tactics. And different actors, states and non-state actors, are learning from China to Poland and Hungary, and where Russia has been one of the leading countries in this development. Me personally, I lived and worked in Moscow for several years, and so I was exposed to, you know, this very propagandistic turn in Russian media already in the beginning of this century. But the first time I saw it being used and realized that it had been used as a tool of statecraft or foreign policy was the Russia-Georgia War in 2008, where I was, you know, I was looking at the Russian TV news in the evening, and in May, June 2008, there was a lot of negative reporting all of a sudden on Georgia. And in August that year, there was the war, but it had been prepared for several months before. The population was sort of prepared for a conflict in the sense that it had been legitimized. And so these tactics have expanded in concentric circles. First, the target was the Russian population, then, you know, increasingly post-Soviet countries. And now it's undeniable that since 2013-14, Russia is operating very ambitiously on sort of scale of world politics. they are now applying these tools and techniques to countries also in the West in a way that is much more direct than what we have seen before. And following these trends, another trend is, of course, the fact that other states and non-state actors are learning these tactics. Because the big benefit of these tools in foreign policy is that they're very cheap. They cost very little in contrast to ordinary military weapons and soldiers that you have to feed and provide. When we're talking about the threats, first let me say what I do not think is the big or main problem here in countries such as Sweden or any other Western democracy. I don't think that Sputnik, RT, China's CCTV, etc. are the main concerns here. They may be tendentious and propagandistic, but their impact, I think, or on a threat scale, they're relatively low on that scale. Also, states have the right to conduct public diplomacy. And I'm not sure the right path here, as we saw recently in the US, where RT was labeled a foreign agent, is the correct path. The challenges that I think are the most important are the clandestine and much more subversive tactics that are being used in order to influence decision-making and public opinion in the West. And in Soviet and Russian tradition, these were the so-called active measures: disinformation, front organizations, buying political influence, spreading fake documents, etc. As you know, this was detailed by Jessica and Ed in the previous panel, and they added, of course, also what we have now in contrast to the Cold War is the cyber and IT domains. I'll just briefly, before I stop, mention two concerns that I have that I think we could perhaps talk a little bit more about. One is the rise of the authoritarian partnerships. So in the last years, Russia, the Kremlin, or the power party in power, a united Russia party, has forged alliances with EU parties in the EU, such as Lega Nord, Front National, Alternativ für Deutschland, and the Austrian Freedom Party. And they also, on the left, have supporters such as Die Linke in Germany and Syriza in Greece. I think these sort of authoritarian partnerships is one of the sort of developing trends that are potentially threatening us politically. Another example is, of course, comes from other authoritarian states, such as Turkey, China, perhaps Iran, that already we see attempting to influence and meddle in EU domestic politics. The other challenge or concern that I have is the rise of the global corruption. We talked about here, Peter, you mentioned the sort of globalization and its impact on the information domain or the sort of media market. You also have a global market for corruption. And how Western companies, law firms, banks, etc., real estate companies help create these unholy alliances with authoritarian regimes. And we saw that in the Panama leaks, the revelations that the Council of Europe is receiving huge amounts of cash from authoritarian states. In that specific revelation, it was Azerbaijan. But if Azerbaijan can successfully influence EU member states, then who else cannot do it? And so these two threats or concerns, authoritarian cooperation and diffusion, and corruption, I think, combine two concerns as well. We could perhaps talk a little bit more about.
Thank you so much. I was thinking about, as you spoke, since you also have a historian approach a lot to what you do, and you mentioned Georgia, and we heard also from Edward Lucas that it's not new, the disinformation, and we know this. But what can we actually learn from history, do you think? If you look at what happened, then your experience in 2008 and where we are now, what would you like us to really, what can we learn from that history?
There are many things, but I think if the main concern today is the so-called, well, let's simplify it, call them the non-military threats, then we should also focus on building the resilience for these non-military threats. That doesn't mean that I underestimate the military ones, but one thing we did during the Cold War was building up knowledge about the countries on the other side of the Iron Curtain. I have here in my hand a book, an anthology with articles that were published in Svenska Dagbladet, the leading daily newspaper in Sweden, 60 articles, essays written by the teacher at the Sigvard Lindqvist. He was a Russian language instructor for 40 years at the Tolkskolan, the military interpreter academy, as part of the Swedish armed forces. He educated generations of diplomats, soldiers, future public servants in the Russian language and the life behind the Iron Curtain. This was all of these efforts that were implemented from the 40s, 50s, and onwards. In the last 25 years, there was very little. We have a lot of rebuilding doing, and that's just about talking about Russia and the Russian culture, political history, and so on. We have a lot of other issues that we also need to understand much better, and this is one of my big concerns, that we understand our threats too little. And it's much too shallow.
We can come back to that also. I think it's interesting with what you find in open sources, for instance. If you know the language, yes. You don't need to be, no, it doesn't need to be state secrets. It's out there, but it's not available for us if we don't know the languages of other actors or cultures. And we are moving on here in our panel to our next speaker, Mikael Tofvesson, who is acting deputy head of coordination and operations department at the Swedish Civil Contingencies Agency, MSB. And Mikael is responsible for MSB's activities to identify and counter information influence activities. And you also lead the agency's efforts to protect the Swedish election 2018, in September 2018, from influence operations. So a very warm welcome to you, Mikael, and you will elaborate on these issues for us.
Yes, thank you very much. And listening to what everyone has said here today, I feel like maybe I should just throw these papers away. A lot of things have been said, but also the focus have shifted back and forward. So I would like to start with a comment that Edward Lucas mentioned here, that how we should perceive what's going on around us. And we're talking about influencing, and it could be an influence operation, influence campaign, or influence activity, but it is really about influencing our behavior. So our behavior will be something good for the one who is influencing us. And looking at it that way, it doesn't have to end in war, but it could have effects that would be war-like, for instance, a change of our system, how our society works. And that's something we need to have a close look at and be alerted about, that we are not really in control of our own society if we don't protect ourselves. And when it comes to elections, so therefore I think competition is a good word here to work with, because it could be a small thing, like an advantage in a negotiation between our countries, or with the country that is trying to influence us, or it could actually be that they're fed up with us as an annoying country in their sphere of interest. And when it comes to elections, it's about also decision making. And before you behave, you decide something, you make a decision, and then you act. Well, usually you do that anyway. And if you're not really controlling your own behavior, you might be subjected to reflexive control. Someone will make you act in a way that you don't control yourself. But usually it's dependent on your own decision. And during an election, that's when the whole society decides the major direction we should take for the next 4 years. And that's also when we decide who should make those decisions for us. And therefore, that's why we're looking into this election. Our agency hadn't been working with elections before, because what we saw in the United States was an eye-opener and made us focus more on this issue. And I don't need to mention what happened in the States. I think everyone here knows it. And we also know that Not all elections have been manipulated and influenced, but it can happen. And looking at our country, when it comes to influencing our country, I would say that we have a lot of vulnerabilities. For instance, we're an open democratic society. Our populations, our politicians, our journalists are accessible. And even our media is in a sector where you can buy your spot and reach our population through media. Everything is open, everything is possible. And thereby it gives you an opportunity to really influence our election. But seeing this, we realize that there are a lot of methods. We have our vulnerabilities, but they have to be matched to capabilities of the countries that will affect us. And looking at the US election, we saw 4 areas that what the United States says the Russians were doing, but at least someone was operating against the US election in 4 major areas. One was to undermine the confidence or the trust of the election process, that this was a real election. The other one was actually to influence or affect the ability to vote by sending, for instance, SMSs saying that you can SMS vote for Hillary Clinton. But we also saw influencing of the political preferences by agitating and creating polarization in the general debate through fake accounts and fake news. And finally, something that we're really seeing right now, subversion or direct contact influencing political figures and officials to create a distrust to that part of the system, of the society. And looking at other elections, we realized in Sweden that there are actually 2 major capabilities you have to have here to counter this, because in the US, a lot of different actors saw what was going on at their part, but they weren't able to protect the election. So what we are focusing on right now, and what we think is important to our election, is first to create awareness. And when I talk about awareness, it's not the fluffy thing, oh, there is a threat going on. I'm talking about knowing that this can happen to me in my position or to me in my organization, and know how I should prepare myself and counter it when it happens. That kind of awareness. The other thing is also that we have to be better coordinated and communicate better. Because as we saw in the United States, a lot of different actors saw what was going on in their small part, but they had no one to call. So we need to create a firm system where all the actors are easily accessible and can communicate when they see a threat, and also get help from the other ones. So communication, coordination, and awareness. But also finally realizing where I started here is that an aggressor will not influence or attack our election because they don't like elections. Well, maybe they do, but what the important thing is here, what will happen after the election? In what state will we be then? And what kind of an actor, international actor, will Sweden be? So therefore, I would say that that is when the real game begins when it comes to countering influence operation or and protecting our society. Because this is a part, influencing an election is just, I would say, a small part of a major plan of actually gaining control over other countries around you. And that is what we need to counter. And finally, the problem here, as we've seen also, is it's not up to Sweden whether our election will be influenced or not. It's up to us to prepare ourselves if it will be, and thereby and therefore focus on our vulnerabilities before they are being exploited, and then of course countering also and showing it's not worth it, to make it less cheap and more costly to the aggressor than otherwise. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. I wanted to pick up on something that Peter mentioned, and that my colleagues at Atlantic Council also have put light into, and that's the combination of state actors like Russia and combining with non-state actors like the Albright movement, and as you said, thereby blurring the line between domestic and foreign, between state actors and other state actors. And you, with MSB as a public authority, how does this mess up your work, so to say, in trying to counter? You have various actors coming in, some of them within one legislative framework, then if it's a foreign state actor, but if it's a domestic non-state actor and they interact together, how does that influence your work?
Yeah, and our perspective here is actually that attribution is almost impossible in the beginning when something happens. So let's get first thought, if you get a punch, you would like to punch back because you don't know who to punch, really. And especially if it's not another state actor, if it's really your own population, you shouldn't punch. So you have to have another perspective regarding this problem. That's something we look into, and that is, what are the effects of this specific influence activity? Will it create social unrest, or will it create panic, or will it create distrust against the authorities, or will it in some way influence the functionality of our society or our fundamental rights? Right. Then we need to counter the effects of that. That's the first point. As we are doing that, then we can start focusing on who's behind this. And if it's a legal thing, we'll serve it to the security service or the police force. If it's part of a military attack, then we will serve that information to the military. But of course, first of all, we will report to the government, and then we will create a coordinated response. But never just run into the first idea of seeing the aggressor, because usually you will never find it out. Or like in the US elections, it took months before they realized what really happened.
Peter,
but I'm nodding yes. I wasn't being like Turkish there, like, whoa, no. I agree completely. So let's take, and I've seen this play out in different countries, this lack of thinking about what is the effects, because that's what you should be thinking about to counter. So let's just call it country X, with a large Russian-speaking population, who are definitely influenced very aggressively by the Kremlin, and they're made to feel you're second-class citizens in the country you live in. They treat you like shit, love Putin, with all the consequences of that. And the reaction of politicians in that country X, from the host kind of ethnicity, is always, this shows that all the Russians here are fifth columnists, which of course, by using that rhetoric, is exactly what the Kremlin wants. Look, they all watch Kremlin TV, they must be fifth columnists. That is exactly the reaction that the Kremlin is trying to play on. They're trying to further polarization. So by calling it out and countering it, you've completely walked into their trap. We saw this with the whole of the mainstream media and Donald Trump, constantly getting exactly the reaction he wants. So yeah, we all, and media have a huge role to play in this. I mean, politicians we can't expect anything of. But media have a huge role to play in this. And it's so hard for media to get their heads around it, because we think we're above the world, covering it as a story. We're the story now. We're the ones being manipulated. We're the ones being played. We're the ones being reflexive controlled, which is a very posh word for, spun. And media haven't got their heads around this yet. Or even if they've got their heads around this yet, we haven't understood what on earth we're meant to be doing. Because our instinct is to write, great story, Putin bots, radicalized Wyoming. That didn't just help, that did not help you reintegrate Wyoming into your kind of public discourse by writing that. So it's very hard. I mean, we have to write about it, we have to react to it, but then we're making it worse half the time. And I don't think we've at all established a strategy for it. It's all our fault.
Yes.
But on this note then, because I think media especially, but also state actors, you would not like to, I mean, how do you, and you've been writing about this in your book also, how do you counter this what they do to our society in a correct way? I mean, it's easy to say that, you know, we should present the correct facts, and it should be easily accessible, it should be transparent and so on. But do these facts, do they land the same way as a humoristic you know, notion or a YouTube clip, or what are we meeting out there? How do we risk being accused of state propaganda? It's not facts, it's state propaganda that meets this alternative information that is presented to us. How do you reason about that?
The problem with that question is actually that everyone thinks that there is a silver bullet, that we should counter with humor, or we should counter with facts. When in fact what we are doing then is actually too late. Then they have already targeted and exploited one of our vulnerabilities. And of course we cannot just sit and wait for their operation to go on and put us even further behind. Also, of course, we need to counter, and we can. And for each situation, we need to design the response. But the really important thing here is, which I hope is actually a process going on in Sweden, that now we have created so much awareness, so even our politicians are prioritizing these issues. And you see a lot of journalists out here also writing about this, creating awareness, and hopefully using disinformation and different methods against elections will be so 2016, 2017. But then we come into the next problem, which has also already been mentioned here. What are the other methods? Therefore, when looking at this issue, we need to step back and see in which areas do we have our vulnerabilities. Because if they cannot use disinformation, they will go for economy, or they will go for cooperation or leverage through other countries to do what they really want to do, and that is to influence our behavior. Sorry, I didn't really answer your question there. You just made it into a bigger problem. But that's also because I usually get this question, and it tends to go the wrong. People tend to focus on something very small when the problem is bigger.
Yes, I understand that. But if you take the concrete example in Sweden now, and you work with it now at MSB, psychological defense. And there's been a government initiative to set up a separate authority on that specific issue. We used to have that during the Cold War as well. And I know I tweeted about it on Twitter, and I got hundreds of retweets, a huge interest, but a lot of reactions then from some on this would just be a state propaganda authority kind of thing. And sometimes you can also hear that on dinner conversations and so on. What are you really? What is this? Are you manipulating us? And it becomes more and more sensitive as you approach an election, for instance. All kind of information tends to be politicized. It can be extremely important for a political party trying to win votes, for instance, that information is really not perceived as being perhaps angled or so on. So how do you, what kind of discussions do you have in all these kind of coordination groups that you...
Yeah, and our problem is, of course, that when people say, oh, now they're creating, or we already have MSB, that is a state propaganda organization that will root out all free word in our society and only support mainstream media that will echo the government's will, which is very sad, because someone putting out those ideas knows very little of how this works and what the authorities and agencies are doing. But from my standpoint here, everyone has the right to think that way. Our responsibility is to be trustworthy in our message and actually do a good job to support the main actors in the information environment, not to be the producers of the message. But when something happens that is really awful to us, for instance, there will be misinformation, disinformation that will harm people or the functionality of our society, then we need to put forward the correct information to the major, or to anyone who is in our information environment. And our idea is, of course, that the reader herself or himself has to make the assessment of what is correct. And therefore, that's why we have to have a very critical or resource critical population that thinks for themselves and are not run by disinformation or other actors who are trying to misinform our population.
Mm. I was going to pick up on what Martin said also about the resilience factor of our societies. Because lots of democracies in Europe are also old democracies where you have had public education for a long time, and you have a tradition of voting systems and so on for a long time. Sweden and Finland, I think all the Nordic countries, Sputnik and RT, they were active for a year or so, and then they had to close down their offices in Russia. In Sweden, we have a general skepticism towards Russia, for instance. Just a general dislike if you look at the polls. So in that sense, disinformation coming from that area, you would expect that we would be rather resilient in that area. Do you agree, Martin, or you have also looked at this
well, yes,
from a research perspective?
Well, I do think countries such as Sweden are resilient. We have a lot of things that are apparent strengths and advantages over authoritarian, non-open societies. But every country is individual and individually different. So Jessica Aro, for example, talked in her presentation about this Finnish guy who's a openly propaganda mouthpiece for the Russian authorities, more even probably linked somehow directly or indirectly to security services, Johan Beckman. In Sweden, yes, Sputnik closed down, but the largest, evening newspaper has a journalist who also works for RT, and who is quite tendentious in the way he describes developments in Ukraine to the Swedish audience, and that's, now media outlet with hundreds of thousands of readers, if not in the millions. So every country has, but that's up for the open society to manage those issues, and those are not necessarily threats. Those are, they can be problematic when they become subversive in some way. But it's not a problem for the open society that we have people who are pro-Russia or pro-China. Mm. The problem is that when they allow themselves to be directed in a way that threatens the open society. So, for example, if you're a Swedish journalist and you appear on Russian state TV and you denounce a Swedish academic saying that he's a NATO tool, he works at the some weird foreign policy institute in Stockholm, and you shouldn't trust him. And by the way, Sweden is a very totalitarian country, and together with Jewish media, Bonnier, he controls everything. Then maybe we are in a gray zone, at least. So that will always be the case for open democracies. As Peter pointed out, there will never be somebody proclaiming to be a fifth column. It doesn't work that way. It will be much more in the gray zone, and it will be much more difficult to understand the motives and the factors driving these sort of actors. So we will have to learn to live with it. And I think media has to learn that these issues, these things are out there. and that when they report news, as you, Peter, I think that you mentioned that, you know, the journalists become they are no longer above the world events; they are part of them. And I think by, you know, if you have that understanding of how disinformation works, then I think, you know, you're in a much better position.
Peter, when it comes to this, as you said, journalists are not responding or not realizing the problem of media houses as much as they should have, as I understood you. What would you like to see? I mean, there have been a discussion on fact checking and meeting facts. Is that, are we doing enough on that, or should we move forward? And how should we move forward? Is it with you know, voluntarily measures, or should legislation work? Should we work more with legislation, or what would you like to see for?
Well, there's clearly a regulatory aspect. Sort of the tech companies have appeared, and it's a wild west. So I think that'll happen, and it's starting to happen, and we're looking for the right balance. Germany went too far. They did a law about you're not allowed to have any. For certain types of content in Facebook would be sort of fined 50 million or something for every post. So whatever, it's very hard to get that right, and I hope we'll find it. I mean, that's a natural kind of process. You get new industries appearing, it'll take some time to come up with the right regulation. I'm much more interested in the cultural and kind of media responses, what you call open society. I mean, when TV appeared, the BBC kind of was invented as a response to this new technology. When radio, same thing as well. Radio was first used by sort of totalitarian regimes with great effect, and it took a while for democracy to go, okay, how do we use these tools for what we believe in a better way? So regulation will only ever get you so far, and if we ever get to the point where regulation is solving the problem, that means we've become authoritarian regimes, so probably not going to happen. So you mentioned open societies several times, but which is a very interesting concept, but putting it very simply, we're talking about media, NGOs, that kind of sphere. Completely and utterly unprepared to deal with the new reality. Just the way we've been built. Media was meant to. Media is now not trusted. Media is now like the enemy, as you know, the way Donald Trump plays it, or the far right play it, or Russia play it. Media have always been around. You know, you write stuff in order for it to go viral by essentially kind of firing up your base, usually, yeah, by trying to like get your crowd, you know. Supporting you and doing stories that they'll like, and then there's another newspaper which is doing their side, and then you come together in a nice kind of constructive debate. That's not happening anymore. It's slightly different, I think, in Scandinavia and Britain, because you have a strong public broadcast and we have the BBC, but they're pretty much the only media in the world who get up in the morning thinking, okay, how do we reach the people who don't like us? Yeah? But all media are now going to have to start thinking about that a lot more. So at the NSC, the project that we've started there is working with media houses, thinking how can they reach the people who are currently misinformed, who are currently living in a world of fake news, who are currently completely polarized. So in America, that's like half the country. So get up in the morning and try to find different ways of writing completely new ways that will be able to bring them back into a democratic discourse. That's incredibly hard. Media have never thought about that, really. Same with NGOs. NGOs have kind of got used to sort of supporting liberal causes, but they're completely not, I mean, they're not making any effort, and they're not really managing to integrate the bits of society that are, that now have identified themselves as hating those liberal causes. So we need a complete reinvention of open society and the institutions that do that. But that's why we've created the centre at LSE, so it will be fun.
You will lead ahead, but what would you like to see first? If you can just say a few steps, if we look ahead, if we're going to be a bit practical.
Sure. So, well, much like sort of the far right and the Russians and all these people now have a kind of like an international network of sort of media and quasi-NGOs working together, we have to sort of internationalize our open society and our sort of, institutions that do this, which means, for example, a sequence of NGOs throughout Europe, all looking at disinformation and subversive influence campaigns together, having a common taxonomy, a common analysis, and a common response. The moment you have like a think tank in Stockholm, or like a fact-checking organization in Kiev, and something happening in the University of Oxford, nobody's talking to each other. So the first thing would be to internationalize our open society around this theme. We've done it around other themes before, but not around this one. So that would be a very, very simple first step, and perfectly feasible.
And how do you deal with the fact that, I mean, for mass media, a lot, we'll enter this, I guess, in the next panel as well, but I just want to capture you on this as well. The commercialization of mass media. I mean, you have to sell the story, you have to do it fast, you have to, I mean, we could see it here. We have had some Russian teams and big newspapers where you do if you get a really big interview, you want to, sell that exclusively and then build your own story to sell more and more newspapers every day. And how do you combine that commercial kind of hunt with these higher expectations on some kind of altruistic keeping our open society mission?
I mean, I'll be very brief. I think this sort of bit of journalism that we're talking about is as important to society as soldiers or nurses, and should be supported in similar ways.
And the commercial news outlets they are part of the solution. They're not part of the problem. And today, thanks to technology, I have more access to good, in my phone I have, Financial Times, I have Medusa, I have, Russian good journalists, I have access to all possible sort of, news sources. And some of them are commercial, some of them are funded, and organized as NGOs, some of them are public broadcasters, and together that's, is a good example of how the international open society is really giving us access to a lot, and the commercial ones are as important as the others.
I will open up the floor for questions from you, and I see several hands here, starting there. Please introduce yourself also.
Okay, my name is Ole Westberg and I am...
It's upside down.
Sorry. Sorry, my name is Ole Westberg and I'm a former member of parliament, editor-in-chief, diplomat. But Mikael Tofvesson, he has publicly said that his public agency is going to act and follow what's happening during the election. And I wonder, has there been any reactions towards that on the internet? Could you see that this is accepted among those who are following you, or has there been any reactions?
Well, we haven't seen any reaction from any other state actors, foreign state actors. But in Sweden, there have, I would say that mainstream media, if I may say so, have had a very positive response. And for me, positive response is actually just saying what we're doing. But then there are, and I don't know if I dare to say this, but can we call them fringe groups that are probably that doesn't think that the contract between them and the state is really working, and there have been negative effects with, for instance, comments like propaganda or the truth ministry and things like that. So, but on the other hand, that is expected. It's very much like a certain foreign country's narrative regarding our organization anyway. So.
Okay, thank you. Yes, please.
Oh, hello. From the Swedish Defence Research Agency. 3 short questions. Do you think there's a risk of all these tactics that the bad guys use will spread into society and influence spin doctors and politicians so that they themselves use the same methods, thus further undermining our democratic society? Also, I was slightly concerned, in a way I'm glad that we seem to be in the information warfare, because it seemed if we win the information warfare, there'll be economic warfare, and even if we win that, will we then be in the real war? And this is disconcerting. And then also final question, is there something we could learn from the 1950s setup of the original Swedish Defence Agency and psychological defence? Thank you.
Please.
Oh, so that combination between these kind of strange alt-right kind of campaigns that I was describing. So in a lot of countries that has happened already. So in Mexico, for example, Virtually all the parties, but especially the three, the ruling one, is very famous for this. So they'll kind of outsource very similar sorts of campaigns, very similar to the harassment campaigns that Jessica's had. They go to PR companies who have a back door, who get essentially kids, computer science students to do this, and set up sort of targeted harassment of journalists, opposition people, disinformation campaigns. Great report out in the Philippines. Yeah. So we see these in these kind of like hybrid regimes, these sort of like weak democracies. We see a lot of that already. But then again, we may have seen some of that in Brexit as well. It's unclear. So there was a very weird spend on the Brexit campaign. So there was the official campaign, which we could monitor and follow, except we can't because it was on Facebook. We can't monitor anything on Facebook. But in theory, we could monitor it. And then there was a very weird spend that they gave in the last minute to activist groups who could do whatever they like. And there's a big controversy being investigated now by Britain. So bits of that might be happening in more traditional democracies as well. So yeah, what was the other question? About should we return to 1950 Sweden?
No.
Do you want to return to the 1950 Sweden?
No, but do you have any other comments on
yes.
the methods? You know,
Yeah, I mean these sort of authoritarian tactics and what I call the sort of diffusion of authoritarian tactics. It's easy because it's cheap and you can learn them just by looking at what others are doing. So I do think we will see more of it, also in more mature democracies. And we will also have authoritarian states nudging these actors. So for example, a far-right Nazi website had an article, several articles detailing my work in a very negative, biased way, I must say. That was brought up and picked up by Sputnik and RT and amplified in English, Russian, and a lot of other languages. And so then I, was targeted by, all these threats and crap by, Norwegian Nazis and German Nazis, and that's a way of supporting these groups, giving them a platform, nudging them, and making them continue. And then, of course, by buying ads on their websites in roundabout ways, et cetera, you could also financially support it indirectly, and they wouldn't even be aware of it, none of it. And so all of this can happen also in any country.
It's quite funny. I just realized, obviously, this is already happening in Hungary and Poland. I've actually stopped thinking about them as democracies anymore, even though, my God, they're actually in the EU. So yeah, we're already seeing it in, massively Hungary, Poland, the Balkans. But I think in Finland as well, Jessica is more of an expert, but you have politicians kind of encouraging MVLeti and saying, yeah, MVLeti, they're great. That's not officially organizing them, but it's legitimizing and encouraging, hate-filled, whatever we call it, weaponization of democracy, whatever buzzword we're using.
Just a quick comment on the psychological border defense. And the answer is actually yes plus. In 2013, when we started really looking into these activities, the first thing we did was actually me authorizing a researcher at the National Defense University to go through the whole archive. And it was really inspiring because there you had a full organization, well thought through, well structured, and it was able to, increase enormously in a wartime. And that's because in those days we don't have the technology to reach out, so you have to be spread out. We need that. We need to have a firm organization that supports research regarding this, and that will also produce understanding regarding these issues and creating resilience, supporting media, both technically and in any other way that media wants to be supported. But having all that with the new technology environment and the new thinking of our society, we also now, to also go into the next question you had, it's very unfortunate if we take that old organization and separate it and have them doing their thing here, not understanding that we also need to think, have an eye on our critical infrastructures, vital societal functions, our democratic values, crisis communication, and the perception among our population, what worries them, and the rest, because influence campaigns, that is the threat. So therefore, you cannot you work against disinformation and the information part without having it together with the rest. And at the moment right now, we have the rest at MSB, and we're building this other part. So but there will be a new authority, and we will do the best to support the government when they do this, so we will not separate these two vital functions that need to work together.
We have a few more questions. Yes, please.
Hi, Linda Nordlund. I'm an editorial writer at Expressen, and I have a background in politics and PR. And my question is similar to your question, but I would say that we're already there. Both in Sweden and in other democracies, we see that botnets are being used by political actors. The big parties in the US, for example, in the Austrian elections, we saw that the Social Democratic Party paid a PR consultant to create Facebook pages that were very negative, campaigning against Sebastian Kurz, anti-Semitic even. And here in Sweden, we just a few weeks ago, it was discovered that the Social Democrats had employees who were setting up bot accounts. So I think, you know, creating Facebook pages with anonymous from anonymous accounts or botnets, this is already here. So my question would be, is this something that is harming the democracy? Is this something that we need to have a gentleman's agreement between the parties to refrain from? Or should we just you know, wake up, realize that this is the reality we live in, and maybe send journalists like me to hacker camp and teach them how to see through this kind of disinformation or pumped up political campaigns?
Thank you. Where are we on this?
I have like two sides to me, we're pulled in different directions. But, okay, clearly the reality is it's going to get worse. But that's not what I want to think. So yeah, definitely I think we should start going to hacker camp. And I think actually the future of journalism is going to be journalists. The way journalists started to work with photographers in photography a bit, I think journalists are going to start working with data analysts who also, most of them do a bit of hacking on the side when you talk to them. That's going to be a new partnership. That's one of the things we trialed in Germany. And it's hard because they have very different mentalities, different time frames. But I think that's going to be, the data analysts and the journalists have to start working together to keep up with this stuff. But having said that, so in Germany it was very interesting. All the parties, apart from the AfD, agreed not to use botnets. Yeah? There was a really big no-no. Funnily enough, in Italy, Cinque Stelle, who are the most technologically kind of developed of the parties, the Five-Star Movement, which is interesting because most parties are political parties with a digital department. Here it's a digital company which happens to have a party sort of plastered onto it. So everyone thinks they are using botnets, but because they claim to be organic, they are the voice of the people, they get infuriated by the idea there's any inorganic activity. So I mean, in America you have the opposite extreme where everyone uses botnets all the time and it's considered normal. Yeah? We saw what that has led to. So maybe in the EU we could develop some sort of common set of norms around this. And so someone deviates, which is quite easy to catch, then we say, oh, well, this party's not playing by them like that. I so hope that happens. No chance, is it? You know, we can all agree, and then when things hit the fan, it'll be incredibly dirty. You're right, the Austrian election was a real development. And if I understood the story in the Austrian election, so it was the nice party setting up websites for the right-wing party, but which were kind of sort of fascist ones, trying to smear the other side as fascist. That's pretty active measures.
But is this part of our, strength, or is it part of our weakness that we tend to be very careful with the legislative measures in these, and perhaps we want these gentlemen's agreements, or at the same time it seems as if democracies fail to control algorithm, dark ads, and Google and everyone, but the dictators have been very successful, and the authoritarian tactics comes from them. So we are increasing our own vulnerability at the same time. We don't get out of this, it seems.
I mean, I agree that a gentleman's agreement among political parties, in theory, should be the optimal solution to this problem. But as any cartel, we know from experience, they will sooner or later, one of the companies in this cartel will try to benefit by, dumping the price or increasing production. And so they are unstable by nature. But there's an external element here which could perhaps be an incentive to behave, which is the fact that when you play with these tools, they can be also abused. When you start using botnets, somebody else can go in and amplify them. When you start creating fake websites, others can go in and do it as well. And you won't even know what's going on anymore. So perhaps the sort of external threat element could be a sort of force of discipline here. It might have to get worse before it gets better.
Do you have a legislation on your wish list?
Not at all, actually,
No.
because really, the vulnerability here is also our strength. We have the freedom of speech, but we also have the individual right to be anonymous, so to use our freedom of speech, and that's something we really need to protect. Looking at this and the problem that you put forward here, and for myself, I am not interested in reading or being influenced by a botnet. So if we start from there, I think we will always prevail in some way and find a way to get a solution to this, because since it's a consumer's market, not even Twitter or Facebook will eventually, if they can't make money out of this, they will find a solution. And so I think it's more or less up to us. And eventually we get fed up with being bombarded with trash. So we want quality eventually. Our problem right now is that we're used to not to pay for quality. So how do we get past that threshold? I think that is something we need to do. Or find another way of financing good quality, how should I say, not only news, but media in general. So I have a positive outlook in long run, even though it doesn't look good right now.
I can say one thing about the tech companies, the big ones. I'm more sympathetic towards Twitter and Facebook, although they, obviously allow a lot of crap to be disseminated through their platforms. They are at least talking about the problem, and saying that they'll try to solve it. One, will have to change its business model. One will perhaps have to go out of business. That remains to be seen. But the one tech platform that worries me more is Google. Because people do not go on Twitter expecting to get like the neutral newsfeed. Everybody creates their own pravda. And so, but you go to Google to, find out about political parties. If you want to engage in an NGO, if you want to find some information about some critical subject. And the fact that Google refuses to recognize the fact that the search algorithms can be manipulated, I think that's one of the big challenges we have in the debate about the role in our democracy.
Well, one of the few successes of RT was after one of the big kind of Russia stories in America. You looked it up. I can't remember which one of the scandals of Trump. And the top 5 stories on Google were all from RT. So they played the algorithm and they managed to get like their version of a fairly important American political event out. And Google are aware of it. They're constantly playing, changing their algorithm and tweaking it, and they react pretty fast. But yes, it's constantly being manipulated.
Yeah.
And a positive thing here then is actually that we are engaging all these major companies now, having a discussion with them in 2 ways. One is that we're inviting them to our meetings and conferences, and unfortunately they're being totally smashed by everyone. Everyone is saying, what the hell are you doing to our societies? They're taking a lot of tough punches right now. But I would also like to stress that we are engaging now in a very positive dialogue, because they know if they will not cooperate, there will be laws. And they don't like that, because then they lose the control of their business.
Do we have more questions from the audience?
Oh, come on.
Come on. Yes, here we go. Thank you. Don't be shy.
Thank you. Karolina Wendelpalin from the Swedish Defence Research Agency again. I think Ed will be happy to know that I did my homework and read your book. My question then would be, because it seems to be many of the things that you described about the domestic media market in Russia was then applied to influence abroad. Can we see something happening today, for example, in the Russian election campaign that could be successfully used to target other countries?
Well, actually a strange loop happened in Russian history. So after the end of the Soviet Union, all these mid-ranking secret service information warriors, these active measures guys, who'd been doing the campaigns throughout the West that Edward and others had mentioned, were suddenly out of a job when they came back to Moscow. And a lot of them started to work as PR guys for the new political parties. And so the whole Russia in the 1990s was basically a bunch of old KGB guys doing disinformation about, politician on politician or company on company. And so they took the sort of like the foreign policy disinformation operations, internalized them, and have now exported them again. There's been a nice cycle there. What's happening now? So the Kremlin has, I'm trying to think, I don't have an answer, I'm trying to literally think this through. So they've responded in several ways to what they saw as the democratic potential of the internet. One of them, the main one, was to flood it with so much disinformation, you can't tell the difference between true and false. It's very interesting. I was recently doing an analysis of the Russian internet, and I saw one from 2010, and it's amazing. It was this beautiful map that was done by guys from MIT, and everybody was talking to one another. The liberals, talking to the nationalists, a democratic internet, everyone talking, discussing what's the future of Russia. Really exciting. I remember those, that's the pre-Bolotnaya kind of thing. And now it's completely decimated. So they went in, they flooded it, and now everybody's fighting each other or not talking to each other, or, And the Turks have done the same thing, the Chinese do something similar. They've worked out you can't do censorship 20th century style. So now, and here's the twist that we haven't really caught up with, you can flood it with so much bad information, it acts almost like censorship. And yeah, I think we're seeing that repeated everywhere. Sergei Guriev, who's now the chief economist of the EBRDs, a Russian economist, has even worked out a formula for how much disinformation you need to good information in order for the information not to function anymore with any kind of purpose. And yeah, no, we see that everywhere. That seems to be a universal tactic. So yeah, a bit of that, I guess, is what we're seeing.
Just before closing the panel, I just wanted to touch upon one final topic. And if this is warfare, indeed, one of the themes for a national military and security conference that was just held here in Sweden, up in the north in January, was that the military talked more and more about endurance, the importance of endurance, of being able to pursue and to stay on for very long. And sometimes you have a feeling about this kind of messaging and so on, that the West doesn't really have the endurance or the patience to keep on pushing the same kind of messages. I just saw here this fact. It was someone showed on it was a Jessica on Russia. There is no proof that there are Russians acting in Ukraine, for instance. That's something we have heard for a few years now. And you can present a lot of proof, and then sometimes you get, by the end you get tired of just telling the same message. How do we keep ourselves engaged in what we believe in, and who do you believe has the most patience and most endurance, or how can we inject that to ourselves, to our societies?
Injecting endurance, I'm sure that's illegal. Steroids.
Legislation again.
Well, I think things are much worse than that, in the sense that I know the West still exists as NATO and the EU, but it kind of, as an ideological, imagine it as a word cloud. Word cloud is very fashionable now. The big change from the Cold War, and actually we've just done a huge analysis of the difference between countering disinformation in the Cold War and now, which I'm happy to send to anyone who wants it. You kind of had this, collection of concepts that came together: freedom, facts, democracy. They were kind of, actually support for sovereignty and internationalism. And they all sat together in a word cloud that meant the West, with a Beatles soundtrack in the background. What's been so interesting now is that we're completely out of that. So I know the old institutions exist. I'm not saying the West is over. The military alliance is still there. But as a kind of informational idea, it's disappeared. So in America, you have this bizarre thing where Republicans are now pro-Putin, and Democrats now love the FBI and hate Russia. It's just like, what the hell happened there? In Britain, again, the old allegiances are all splitting up, which is very, very disorientating. On the other hand, I'm seeing the emergence of a new coalition of ideas. So I was doing one of these Russia-ish events in London recently, and I kind of looked around the room. I was in Prague. And there was like old Cold War warriors who still think about it that way, which is still a completely valid way to look at a lot of these problems. Then there were young people who had never heard of the Cold War. They were digital rights activists, and they were just furious that this Putin guy was messing with the internet they'd grown up with. They're actually pro-Snowden, very much pro-Snowden, but also incredibly anti-Putin, because this is digital rights is for them what human rights were for 1970s people. This is their lifeblood and where they are, and they wanted sort of it to have coherence and values. Then there were people who really care about sort of LGBT issues. So this strange coalition was forming, our own sort of Queer Front, and I wonder whether something new will be born out of it, because it has to be deeper than there are Russian soldiers in Ukraine. It has to be. And here I will use the language of NATO, a strategic narrative, which means it's much more than that little fact. It really is a vision for what society should be. And I think slowly, and maybe Russia's weirdly helping in some perverse way, that's starting to coalesce, and I'm very excited by that. But still, it's just like a word cloud that's coming together. But it's very exciting.
Martin and Mikael, you have reflections on the word cloud.
Yeah, no, I mean, exactly. And the challenge, of course, with disinformation and world politics, all of this is a component. All of this is a global phenomenon. But as it dawns us as that this is part of the everyday situation, we will no longer be sitting here talking about it at a conference. It will be part of our mentality that this is this is how we understand the world. It functions like this. It seems to operate in certain ways that are problematic sometimes if we can deal with them, and if we have an idea of where we want to go, then we can manage that problem much more easily.
Any word on endurance?
Yeah, the problem there is that since we are Russia, for instance, they're working for to create bilateral conflicts and competition. And the response for us should, of course, then be leverage, for instance, for Sweden, the EU. And every fourth year we have an election here, and all our democratic countries have elections, which means that the politics will change, sometimes slightly, sometimes a lot. So the possibility to have endurance in one major issue is problematic for the EU. And in other words, for our leverage, which means that for us, I think it's always a very important solution to think leverage, quick response, and probably economy, because that's where it hurts. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Well, time is up for this session, and please join me in thanking the panel. I want to give you, on behalf of the organizers, a small token of appreciation. It's hopefully.